Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever this video finds you. Thank you so much for tuning in. In the sermon series, The Good Life, we have been exploring what the good life looks like according to Jesus. Contrary to cultural expectations, the good life isn't found in wealth, health, or status, but in living according to the values of God's kingdom. This time on Deep Dive, we're exploring the sermon called Conflicted. Joining me, I have Pastor Chris Wunderlich. Thank you for joining me. Mercy, peacemaker, persecution. Mm-hmm. That is against the grain from what the world tells us we should do.
And that's what we dug into today, wasn't it?
Yeah. Can we unpack a little bit about mercy and peacemaker and persecution and like a general?
Sure. Well, and like you said, it does seem very against the grain with what society usually tells us, because when we have disagreements with one another, we find ourselves embroiled in conflict. We typically don't default to trying to always make it better. We feel like we have to make people see that we're the right, make them seem like our way is right. A better way to say that. We try to prove to them they're wrong, and we end up not really fixing anything. It just drives more of a wedge between us, and that's where the concepts of being merciful and being a peacemaker really strike a different tone. If we're trying to be merciful to people, we're trying to actually yield a bit to them. We're trying to let go of disagreements that we might have to, I guess, to shift a little bit to where we better understand what they're thinking. And that's required for peacemaking as well. If we're going to be a peacemaker, you can't make peace if you don't understand what the other side's saying.
Right.
Even if you believe they're wrong, you need to understand what they're saying and what they're believing if you're going to bridge this divide that you have between the two of you.
Mm-hmm. So it's like seeing it from their perspective, trying to really look at the entirety of the conflict from all angles.
Right. And the biggest thing that struck me about being a peacemaker is that if you think of just the words being mashed together, peacemaking, it's creating peace. So that means it's indicating that you're making peace where it doesn't exist yet. So that's a little bit different than if you and I have a disagreement and then I just choose kind of not to make it worse. I'm just not going to talk to Mike for a while. His stomach's growling a lot, really distracted. I'm not going to call that out right now. So we think that's making peace.
Yeah.
But it's really just kind of ignoring the tension is all it's doing.
Yeah.
But when we actively make peace, we step into the gap, we step into the conflict, and we say, what can we actually do to understand the situation, and how can we make this better?
Yeah. Would you say it's kind of like almost taking on the conflict, not necessarily you thinking I'm the one that caused this or started this, but almost having that mentality?
At least being willing to accept the fact that maybe there's some degree of responsibility that you own.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So how does the Beatitude, blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy, reflect the character of God, and what does it reveal about the relationship between divine forgiveness and our call to forgive others?
Yeah, so like when we think about, again, all of the Beatitudes really somewhat revealing, your question there is great. How do they reveal the character of God? And mercy gets to the very heart, of, whenever we show people mercy, we're yielding. We're not holding them to like accountable for something that we feel that they deserve.
Yeah.
We're yielding. And when we look at how that reflects the character of God, when we acknowledge the fact of that we oftentimes fail to live how God wants us to live. We, as Paul had said, that we find ourselves opposed to God. We're enemies of God. But while we were yet enemies, Christ died for us. And in that, they're being Christ and God was showing mercy to us in that, willing to say that we're not going to harbor this guilt against you anymore.
Yeah.
To translate that more into like, that's the revealing of the character of God, but then how that translates for us in terms of, like you mentioned, forgiveness. That mercy leads to forgiveness of us by God through the work of Christ. And as I said in the message that I hit on, that everyone is someone for whom Christ died. So everyone is someone who God is willing to show that mercy to in Christ. And when we find ourselves unwilling to show mercy, that by default is we're saying, I'm not going to show that person mercy, even though God does.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what should strike us a little bit hard whenever we look at these situations, is that every one of those situations where we're unwilling to forgive, we're unwilling to make peace, we're unwilling to show mercy, if we're being honest, we have to say, yes, I'm not going to be merciful. I'm not going to make peace. I'm not going to forgive that person, even though God does.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that should be heavy for us to deal with.
Right. And you spoke about it in the sermon about, like, something that should kind of move us a little bit about when, if God forgiven us, and so we should forgive others, but if we don't forgive others, does that mean God won't forgive us? And there was a lot of theology there, but it's having that mentality. It makes you think, and I took a note here, Matthew 18:21-35. The king, paraphrasing, the king forgave the servant of his debt, but the servant himself turned around and didn't forgive the debt of his other servant. So it's almost just like that parable there.
Yeah, and like you said, so often you can read those verses that we use in the message and just kind of take them on their own and pull them out of context a little bit and say, well, yeah, if you don't forgive someone, then you're not forgiven anymore. You've lost your salvation. You've lost your way as a follower of Christ, and you no longer have that secured. But if you start shifting and looking at it in context of everything else, it's really revealing and getting at a heart posture.
Mm-hmm.
It's not getting to saying like God's unwilling to forgive you anymore, or unwilling to save you. It's more of, do you really understand God's forgiveness?
Mm-hmm.
And do you accept that? And if you do, then it should be reflected in how you live your life.
Right. I mean, because you believe that.
Yes.
You believe that. So in a world that often glorifies conflict and division, how can we practice being a peacemaker in our daily interactions, especially when forced with situations that challenge our patience and forgiveness?
It's a good question. We'll tune in next week.
Yeah, we'll tune in next week.
Run that by me one more time. So it's current situations,
so it's
conflict.
Yeah, so basically in a world that glorifies or like almost promotes, like you need to be at odds with this person. Do not, don't try to make this work. They wronged you, move on. So how in these interactions do we become that merciful and peacemaker, and how do we, like you said in the sermon, it's not just about, okay, I'm going to get to reconciliation. There's a time for that.
Sure.
So how, in situations that challenge that patience and that forgiveness, and we're forced, how can we practice in that?
That is hard because, like we've said before, we do find ourselves in situations where it seems like we're constantly pitted against someone else. And it may not be us individually, but it may be groups that we're a part of. This group mentality of like it's us versus them seems to crop up all of the time. And that does make it hard. But I think when we get into like what I said before on the forgiveness, we do have to have a posture of the heart of willingness to forgive. And I think what you said there from the message is great. Like, we have that timing, that wisdom and timing and communication aspect, and we can't forget that our goal is to reconcile. So when we find ourselves in these situations in everyday life, in culture, in politics, on social media, whatever it might be, where we find ourselves at odds with someone, we have to determine how we need to engage.
Right.
What's the best way to engage? What's the most Christ-honoring way to engage in that thought? And sometimes for our own well-being, there are lines that need to be drawn. But we always have to be asking ourselves, like, what are we trying to achieve with this? There's going to be times where this is one thing that we didn't dig real deeply on in the message, but reconciliation, it works two ways. I need to have a willing heart to forgive and approach reconciliation and do it with wisdom to you if we're at odds. But likewise, if we're going to really achieve that, you have to be willing to.
Yeah.
So we have to own up the fact that living in a broken world, there's going to be times when the other party is just not there.
Yeah.
It's maybe the situation itself was too emotionally tense for you, for the other party. again, like I mentioned, the message, maybe there's abuse or trauma involved that you
Mm-hmm.
need some professional guidance and counseling to make sure that it's done safely and wisely to protect yourself and to protect the other person.
Mm-hmm.
And there's going to be times that if I push forward to engage on this, it's going to make it worse.
Yeah.
No matter where my heart's at, it's just going to make it worse, maybe because of where you're at.
Yeah.
And there may be times where my heart is willing, but it's just too raw right
Mm-hmm.
now. I might say the wrong. It's just not gonna work out. And that's where we have to be wise with it. We have to remember that the goal is to reconcile, and ultimately our heart needs to be bent toward that.
Yeah.
But also realize that there's gonna be times that maybe it's not healthy for us at the time. Maybe it's not healthy for them. Maybe real reconciliation is not going to be possible in this moment.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to pray for God's guidance of how we can deal with that. But ultimately, we're responsible for our own hearts.
Yeah.
We can't change someone else's heart. That's between them and God. Only the work of Christ can change a heart and bend that posture a
Mm-hmm.
different direction.
Yeah.
And so ultimately, as much as we would like to be able to change a heart, all we can do is work on ourselves and promote that posture toward other people that embodies the good life that Jesus has put forward. And hopefully in that embodiment, people see the love and the grace and the mercy and the peacemaking effort, the characteristics of God, the work of Christ playing out in our lives, where maybe they see that's something that they would like to pursue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would. It's you said in the sermon that it's the timing, and you just said it now, and praying for Jesus to intervene in those moments. And it just kind of dawned on me that I catch myself even with my wife. We when we get into our tiffs or whatnot, I try to resolve it right away, but you just said like it just takes time, and sometimes in that moment when I'm trying to make it work, trying to make it or reconcile. It's almost in a way I'm kind of being selfish because maybe she's not ready.
Yeah.
Or, and I think that can be a lot of situations, maybe just taking a step back and really evaluate, am I perceiving this wrong? Or, so.
Because there's multiple sides of that. There's your willingness and your readiness, and that's coupled with, like you said, your perception of the events, and you're all the while assuming how she's perceiving the events, and also her willingness, readiness, and perception of everything too. So there's a lot of assumptions in play there. So that's something that has to be navigated throughout those processes.
Yep. Well, Pastor Chris, thank you so much.
Thanks, Mike. Enjoyed it again. Always enjoy the deep dives.
Awesome. And I'm glad that you do, and I'm hoping you guys do too. Jesus, even in his crucifixion, modeled ultimate forgiveness and peacemaking. His plea, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, serves as our example. If Jesus can forgive in such circumstances, how much more should we seek to live out this truth in our daily lives? Thank you for tuning in to this week's Deep Dive. If you have any questions, be sure to message us directly or leave a comment below, and we'll try to answer them next week. Until then, have a blessed week.